Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in the Mississippi and the Civil War series, which we conducted at the Old State Capitol Museum in Jackson, Mississippi in November of 1996. What has made this particular program particularly enjoyable is the potpourri of different themes and subjects that we have addressed in it, and the people who we brought forward to talk about these. You have previously met Brian Steele Wills, who at the time was a professor of history at Clinch Valley College, which later became the University of Virginia College at Wise. Stuck way, way, way down in southwestern Virginia. Brian was from around Suffolk, Virginia, and his subsequent works include a study of the people in the Civil War around Suffolk and Southside Virginia. And he subsequently, in the past years, has turned his attentions with perhaps his biggest and most recent project being a biography of Virginian George Thomas, who was from his area down in Virginia and who stayed loyal to the Union. His first major biography that's been done of Thomas in a number of years, and it will stand the test of time as the finest of its genre. So Brian is a fine scholar. He has subsequently moved on, and he is now the director of the Civil War Center at Kennesaw State University, just north of Atlanta, which seems to me to be a really great fit for him because Thomas's presence is within that corridor for the Atlanta campaign operations in Tennessee and so forth. And his longstanding work on Nathan Bedford Forrest rode into Tennessee and into Alabama and into Mississippi. And so Brian finds himself in the position of being very conveniently located to all the things that he has done his academic research on and his publications on. In this case, I thought that I would juxtapose two cavalrymen in two separate lectures in this Mississippi and the Civil War, because each has a different story and each has a different reputation. Of course, you have seen Forrest in other lectures, and we'll see him in additional lectures in this series. Why Forrest? Recently, I was criticized in a dispatch that we had come out with in our dispatches series that we send out to people by email. And I had done a thing of Forrest's staff, and in another instance, I talked about Forrest's family. And somebody came back very indignant about the offensiveness of talking about Nathan Bedford Forrest. And I responded back to him, and I noted many of the contradictions in Forrest and the richness of Forrest and his life and his opportunity. You know, in town here in Chatham, we have perhaps the richest man in town is a great philanthropist, but he made his money in waste disposal, garbage, because nobody else would do it. You know, and so he found an opportunity and he exploited it to its fullest degree, and has become extraordinarily wealthy and has expanded out into energy now, and is one of the most important people philanthropically in the region because of his successes in doing what he could do that needed to be done. Well, if you look at Nathan Bedford Forrest in that kind of a way, he was not a man of letters. He didn't go to college. He was not well spoken or anything along those lines. And he lived in the frontier area. He lived in and around the Memphis area. And so in looking for something to do, Forrest was tough-nailed. He was tough as nails. He was a frontiersman. There were things that he could do. And one of the things he decided he could do well was he could manage slaves. He could manage this peculiar institution and things that had to be done. He could intimidate. He could maintain order. He could discipline if need be. And so he became wealthy as a slave trader. in the region. And when the war came, he enlisted as an enlisted man just to fight, and he used his own resources, money he had made from the slave trade and so forth, to fund a unit that he was in, and ultimately they recognized his potential and his innate leadership capabilities, and they elevated him to an officer status. He became a colonel, and if you look at his military history throughout this, it is one leadership opportunity after another. I mean, he's the sort of guy that you just look at, so much so that over the years, people have opined, oh, what if Forrest had been given command of the Army of the West instead of Hood or instead of Bragg or any of these other people? Oh, how much better it would have been. Well, we don't know that. What we do know is that Forrest wasn't a very disciplined man. He had a hair trigger temper, and he was undisciplined to the extent that he saw a problem, he went to fix the problem. He didn't sit back and look at all the ramifications that were associated with it. And so he became what Sherman labeled him, that devil Forrest. And so his biography is rich and enriching and enlightening. And rather than try to defend Forrest here as an introduction to this talk, but I did want to give you a little bit of that background, because he's one of these people, just like Robert E. Lee and some of these other folks have now been labeled in the modern times. They didn't have that reputation even 20 or 30 years ago, and they certainly didn't have that reputation in their times. Forrest becomes, after the war, he's reviled for his perception, A, that he was a slave trader, B, that he massacred Black troops at Fort Pillow, controversy that still inflames people and maybe is true, maybe is not true. Most likely the whole truth is somewhere in between, in the middle. There are many books written on Fort Pillow. I recommend those to you. But after the war, he's working to try to support his staff people. There are problems in the South where all of the formerly enslaved people are now freed, and they're trying to make a way and integrate themselves into a new world. And disenfranchised Southern soldiers and other leaders look for ways to control. And Forrest, responding to a request from his young artilleryman, John Morton, accepts a position as the Grand Wizard of a new organization known as the Ku Klux Klan. He doesn't stay in that position long, and he certainly doesn't have a long history with it. And it's a much darker deeds and hatred that spread throughout the remainder of the 19th century and into the 20th century. But he's still tarred with that paintbrush, and overlooked is the fact that he realized the errors of what he had done, and he found religion, he found Christ. He begged people for forgiveness, was very religious when he finally died. So redemption is in the eyes, in most instances, of the beholder, and I find it fascinating to look at Forrest. And so I think you will find a wonderful, wonderful presentation from the man who knows Nathan Bedford Forrest better than anybody else. So please sit back and enjoy a presentation of the South's finest pure fighter, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Best introduction I've ever heard. The man understands it. So here's our talker tonight, Brian Wells.
I'm just going to kind of sidle up to the old cider thing and go on from here. I'll try to talk nice and loud. If you get to the point where you can't hear me, please let me know, and I'll try to speak louder. It's called projection. We all have to learn to do it in the classroom. So I'll try to do it for you as well. The talk tonight is the finest pure fighter the war ever produced, and I didn't come up with the title. Lynn Rydell had suggested that that might make a nice title, and I said, all right, Lynn, well, we'll go with it. We'll see what happens. And I also did not do one other thing that Lynn likes to have done, which is have an outline, but then I don't think that's so bad either, because I kind of come and go with the things I'd like to say about Forrest, and leaves me lots of room for flexibility. And besides, not everyone should be like Parker and have absolutely every minute of his life organized and disciplined. You need to have people like me that throw monkey wrenches like with impunity. I'm the kind of person for which the word sabotage was invented. Take off the wooden shoe and stick it in the machine, see what happens. So, I'm not going to go with any particular agenda as far as trying to give you something in an outline that I would follow. And I guess in a way that's sort of good, because I didn't realize the way that the restaurant would fit into it. In fact, I think the restaurant's going to fit into the talk real nicely, and I could have made that connection before I was here. So I'll try to do that as well. Nathan Bedford Forrest, most of you know, I think most of you have heard some version of my spiel on Forrest at some point or another. A few of you haven't, and so you were fortunate until tonight, and now you're one of the victims as well. So you're going to have to count yourself as one of the folks that's now unlucky and has to put up with me for a little while. Forrest, of course, was born in Middle Tennessee in the back country, and even though he'll come to Mississippi at a very young age, I don't think it would have made a whole lot of difference, because middle of Tennessee was backcountry and Mississippi was backcountry, and backcountry is pretty much what Forrest was in until he finally, as a young adult, made his way to Memphis. And even it was sort of a backwater town, if you want to call it that. So Forrest was conditioned early on from the backcountry, and I think that's one reason that he went into the war prepared not to be just a trained fighter, which he really was not, but a pure fighter who didn't have any particular training at all, except from his heritage, from his background. Growing up in the backcountry of Tennessee and then reaching his adult years in the backcountry of Mississippi, he learned to handle situations as they arose. He learned how to take care of himself, how to be independent, how to fend for himself, and even in circumstances where, quite frankly, he faced life and death questions, he learned how to survive those, he learned how to move through those without any real difficulties. Forrest was the kind of person who developed certain lifestyle skills that fit well in the battlefield. For instance, he was an amazing person in that he used common sense on the battlefield. I'm sure it astounded hundreds of West Pointers that someone would actually go into the battlefield and do what made sense, do what actually could work in a given situation. For instance, and Parker's done this so well, I hope you'll get the monograph on Bryce's Crossroads, but for instance, he thought you ought to understand the ground on which you were going to fight. You ought to be aware of the conditions in which you would wage war. So he reconnoitered either personally or he ordered people to reconnoiter for him. Second thing is he thought you ought to make the life as complicated and miserable for the enemy as possible. So he tried to mass his firepower. That meant putting artillery in risky positions, even if it might not fit a textbook, and put the artillery up front, put himself up front, do whatever it took to keep pressure on the enemy, and once the enemy broke, keep after them. Don't give them a chance to catch their breath. I think the biggest problem today with the Dallas Cowboys is nobody kept beating the crap out of them. Somebody should have just kept beating them. Then the Packers might have beaten them. I'm a Packer fan. So somebody should have kept Dallas down and kept them and kept keeping them down. And unfortunately, nobody did that. Well, Forrest would have done that. I mean, that was Forrest's nature. That was his style. He was the kind of person on the battlefield that wouldn't let up until the enemy was totally destroyed, totally demoralized, and out really in any real sense of any further ability to hurt them. That is, in case of Bryce's Crossroads, he rode the horse until he fell off of it from exhaustion. So that was ultimately what saved what was left of the Union out of Bryce's Crossroads, was that he simply got too exhausted. And my friend Abraham Buford kept up the the strike until he too was so thoroughly exhausted he didn't know what he was doing. So Forrest applied common sense to the battlefield. He applied a grit to the battlefield and a determination, almost a bulldog determination not to let the enemy go. He applied basic tactics that made sense to anybody in the battlefield. Don't attack up front when you can go around and attack from the flanks. If you can attack from both flanks, that's even better. If you can get in their rear, that's even better. And Forrest did that from the very first engagement that he fought. But the thing that I think makes Forrest the purest fighter of all is that he understood what war was all about. You kill people. There was no muss, no fuss, no gloss, and no glory. You kill people. That's what you do. As the comedian Richard Pryor used to say, that must have been his job because that's all he did. And Forrest was known for killing 30 Union soldiers in single combat, which, as we were saying at the table, is a feat that you can't imagine any other commander being able to boast. One European observer of Forrest's career suggested that no one had done such hands-on killing since Richard the Lionhearted, or Lion-Hearted Richard, as I believe is the way he actually phrased it. Well, Forrest didn't kill because he had nothing better to do. He didn't kill because of some propensity for killing. He killed because he knew that was what war was all about. And if you killed enough of them, then you would win. And if you think about the frontier heritage from which he came, that fit perfectly. In many circumstances with animals or with other human beings, Nathan Bedford Forrest understood that you had to be prepared to go to the wall with an individual. You had to go all the way. You had to be prepared to kill them. At one point when someone confronted him on a back street and he was riding with a lawyer, my wife's a lawyer, actually she's a little bit more than that, but she's a trained lawyer, so I tell her this repeatedly. I'm kind of like the servant that rides with the triumphant general, remember thyself mortal, you know, so that you don't displease the gods. Servant and then after mind her that she's a lawyer, which I think is, you know, says how mortal she is. Well, the lawyer that Forrest was with, someone had such a beef with that he took a double-barreled shotgun, emptied one of the barrels into the guy. Well, the guy dies from this little meeting, and Forrest is left confronting the other barrel. Well, he looks at the other guy and he says, you better make short work of it. Now, that's a person who's got enough wherewithal to handle most any situation. This was pre-war, and yet this man saw death, said that's what it's all about, I'm going to face it, I'm going to deal with it, and dared the other person to go ahead and pull the trigger. Well, the other guy at the murder trial said that he didn't pull the trigger because he wasn't sure he could get the job done. He wasn't sure one barrel would be enough for Nathan Bedford Forrest. Well, Forrest survived and testified against the man. Ultimately, the man's money and position got him out of the trouble that he was in, although his reputation was so ruined that his business, which happened to be slave trading, went down. But then Forrest was also engaged in the slave trade, so one has to wonder about the ulterior motive he might have had for testifying, and his slave trade went up at the same time the others went down. I remember watching a mini-series one time on TV, or documentary, I guess is really a better way to phrase it, in which one of the historians said something like the material wealth of the princes of India went down at the same time the material wealth of Englishmen who engaged in the tea trade went up. Well, there's a correlation. Forrest, I think, had a vested interest for testifying against this guy, and he also was brave enough to stand up against this guy. But Forrest, throughout his whole pre-war life, showed no indication that he was unwilling in any way, shape, or form to go straight to the end with it if it need be, even if it meant his life or the threat to his life. More than once he threatened to take someone else's life if it came down to a choice of his or the other person's. The reason that I think it sort of fits the tone of the restaurant, of course, is cock of the walk, and the idea is that if you were the best pure fighter in the flatboat or in the area, you, for at least the length of time you were there, got to be toasted as the first rough and tumbler or something like that. Well, if you look at the backcountry, that's what it was all about. Reputation and status was everything. And Forrest was acutely aware of reputation and status, that is his own. If you look, he was an up-and-comer. He went westward to improve himself. He went into business with an uncle to improve himself, to make his children's lives better than his life had been. His father went west too for the same purpose originally before he died in Tippah County, Mississippi. So Forrest was the kind of person who looked for the best way to lift himself up. And if that meant you had to intimidate someone, or fight someone, or kill someone, that's what he did. But Forrest, exaggeration was also part of his system, and intimidation was part of his system. I think some of the best pure fighters know how to win sometimes without fighting. If you can get someone else to back down, you've already won the battle. You didn't have to shed their blood. Forrest, on repeated occasions before, during, and after the war, used intimidation to get what he wanted. He was a master at psychological warfare. And he was quick to kill you. I don't want to, Jim McPherson, the Pulitzer Prize winning author, historian, said he was almost like a killing machine. He was so good at it. Well, he was, but that was part of his persona as well. Sometimes later on that meant he didn't have to kill. At Fort Pillow, he sent in a demand that the garrison surrender or it would be put to the sword. And he did that since his first raid in Murfreesboro repeatedly, that threat of killing everyone. Did that show that he was a massacre waiting to happen? No. What it showed was he was a master of psychology, taking advantage of everything in his arsenal, including the fact that he would kill if he had to. He did kill 30 people in single combat. He did have 29 horses shot out from under him. When we live in an age where you press a button and missile blows someone up 100 miles away and the missile comes through a window, that's a different style of fighting. But it's also, again, a style of fighting in which he excelled. Hand to hand, face to face, person to person. At the very first battle that he fought of any consequence, the Battle of Sacramento, Kentucky, at the end of 1861, he rode through the town like a madman trying to get at the enemy, trying to kill someone. In the end, he confronted a number of people, 3 different people, including 2 officers, who had basically apparently made it their mission in life to kill him, because that's what they were attempting to do. He was fortunate that he had the help of one person who distracted one of the 3 while he fought the other 2. Unfortunately, the person who distracted the other 3 died for the distraction. But at any rate, it enabled Forrest to dispatch the other 2. One by sabering him and the other one by knocking him off his horse and separating his shoulder. Now this was typical of Forrest. And not afraid to get into the fight. But I think sometimes so much the pure fighter at this stage in the war that he wasn't a very good commander. A lot of times in the early war he lost, I think, some of the discipline that a soldier needs and gave it up to the exuberance that a fighter has to have as well and enjoys. He was the kind of person who at Shiloh was given a job to do and decided that it wasn't worth guarding that little damn creek when he could go and fight. So he told them, boys, they're fighting and we're here guarding this little damn creek. Let's go and fight. And he left his position. Well, of course, nothing came of that particular action. But think about what kind of an act of insubordination and breakdown in discipline that meant. For Forrest, though, it was more important at that early stage to be a fighter. You see it in in the messages he put out for recruits. His recruitment posters read like a warrior that can't wait to shed blood. After all, he told them that we want shotguns and pistols, things that we can use at close-hand fighting. And he said, come on, boys, if you want to have a heap of fun and to kill some Yankees. When that's your recruitment poster, you get an idea of what the man's all about, what he wants to do. He wasn't there to be seen in a pretty uniform. In fact, the fact that he disdained a pretty uniform saved his life early in the war. There was a doctor named Van Wyck that was riding next to him, and he had the fancy uniform on. And when a bushwhacker shot out of a house at the man with the prettiest uniform, he shot the doctor, not Forrest. So Forrest actually probably saved his own life because the uniform wasn't all that important. It's not to say he wasn't concerned about his appearance, especially early in life, supposedly. He was almost like a dandy. The kind of guy so worried about his hair being in place that people wondered what his worth was. And even later in the war, in his life during the war, Richard Taylor wondered what was wrong with this guy. When the first time he met him, all Forrest wanted to talk about was what potential obstacles he had to face. But Forrest was less the pure fighter at that point and a much, much better leader, much, much better general. He was a person at that point worried about the details that would have to be dealt with and overcome, and not just anxious with bloodlust to rush in and kill someone. Not that he wasn't willing to do that up until the very end of the war. He's engaged in personal hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. But Forrest, with Dick Taylor in the last full year of the war, was interested in all of the details he had to know as a successful commander to get his task accomplished. Taylor said he wondered what he was made of, wondered what this guy was all about. He seemed to be almost reluctant to fight. And yet he said as soon as Forrest had finished asking the questions and getting the answers he wanted, he started going into how he would get the job done. And Taylor said he knew he was okay then. This was the man he wanted. Forrest liked Taylor because Taylor left him alone. Taylor also told him how good he was. But Forrest was very full of himself. Forrest was not above exaggerating stories. He was not above telling things that didn't happen the way he said they happened. He was an embellisher. But then that's sort of what being a soldier is sometimes, except unless I'm sure Parker. But, you know, sometimes it's fun to sit around the campfire and tell the story and embellish it a little bit and add up a little bit more. But Forrest was big on that. Of course, the most famous saying that he supposedly said, "Get there first with the most," or some variation thereof. He may have said, but I'm sure he knew if he looked at his own record, it never happened, it never meant. I often tell groups, if anything, you got there on time with enough. He didn't usually get there first with the most of anything. Getting back again to why he was such a good, pure fighter, it fit the backcountry heritage. Here was a man who had learned how to defend himself against all kinds of opponents and all kinds of circumstances, who had watched his uncle shot down in the street in front of him in a street fight between 4 people, himself and his uncle. He took on those 4 people, ended up chasing them off, and for his efforts, they made him a constable. They made him an official in the town. This is something that I had never known about Forrest until I studied him. That he held, you know, one of these small local offices. I figured Forrest was not the political type, but I don't think he ever minded the accolades of the people. In fact, that's why one fights, to enhance one's reputation and status in the community. I say it's kind of like the old kennel racing commercial. My dog's bigger than your dog. My dog's bigger than yours. My dog's bigger because he eats kennel racing. My dog's bigger than yours. In the backcountry, people lifted you up and made you better when you were bigger, tougher, meaner, harder, whatever. If you were the first champion rough and tumbler, people talked about you. People gave you a reputation and a status which helped you feel better about yourself. I have a colleague who tells me that he thinks that Southern honor that way isn't so. That Southerners can feel good about themselves from within. After all, he says, I went to VMI, I know what honor is. I have honor from within. I said, well, that may be true, but in the backcountry South, especially when everybody else was telling you how good it was, how good you were, that couldn't help but make you feel better about yourself. And when everybody else thought you were a chicken or thought you were a loser, that couldn't help but affect the way you saw yourself too. Those historians who've examined the backcountry talk about why people like to brag, I'm half alligator and half bear. It wasn't because they decided to create a new creature. It was because they were trying to take all of the very best attributes as they saw them in these animals and give them to themselves. Well, Forrest goes into the war with that kind of spirit, with that kind of mentality. It was the mentality that made him in the Battle of Sacramento race ahead of his men, to the point that he was, by one trooper's estimation, about 50 yards in advance of any help by the time he ran into the Yankees. It was that kind of spirit that at Fallen Timbers got him so far in advance of his men in the rear guard action that Parker alluded to earlier, that got him almost killed. It certainly got him shot because the Federals gathered around him and started saying, shoot him.
Could I have your
and fling him off the
attention,
horse.
please? Brad Blake, you have a telephone call in the lobby?
Fred? Well, we don't have
Brad
Fred.
Blake, you have a telephone call in the lobby? I'm
I'm not going to compete with Fred. But anyway, and that's probably his mama checking on where he is. He's the cock of the walk, eh? All right, well anyway, so Forrest is surrounded by Federals who are trying to kill him, and his first instinct, of course, is to get the hell out of Dodge, just to turn around and go back. That's not a very stupid instinct. It makes basic common sense to me, but his exuberance had gotten him into that situation. So he whipped his horse around, but by that time someone had shot him in his side, right into the where the bullet lodged against his spine, very nearly paralyzed him the way his elder brother had been paralyzed in an earlier war. Forrest pulls a Union trooper up, hoists him up behind him as a sort of shield while he rides back to the lines, and then dumps him unceremoniously once he feels like he's clear of the enemy's range of fire. Rides on. Well, typically stubborn, Forrest won't convalesce for long before he decides that this isn't what this is all about. I'm supposed to be fighting, not healing. So he went out and engaged in the activities of camp in preparation for the next conflict, and sure enough reopened the wound and had to have the surgeon come in and remove the ball. So Forrest sometimes got himself into more trouble with his exuberance and his desire to fight, especially early in the war, than he would have if he hadn't been a pure fighter. And I said, though, by the end of the war he was better, he was different, he was still a fighter, but I think he was much more disciplined, more under control, and frankly I think he had learned a great deal. People ask me, could Forrest have ever commanded anything larger than he did? And I say for most of the war, the answer is very definitely no. And the reason that I know that's because Forrest himself knew that. When he had an opportunity to move up beyond what he thought he was capable of, he said no. And when ultimately he was given greater responsibility, he accepted it when he thought he was ready for it. Forrest was not the kind of officer at the beginning who could have gone very far. He's lucky he lived long enough to go as far as he did, from entering the war as a private to becoming a lieutenant general. So Forrest learned as he went along. He also, of course, had to teach his men what he was capable of. It's one thing to have your opponent think you're a wizard. It's another thing for the men to think you are. I think, like a comment made about Claiborne this morning, not too many men loved him at the time. But it's funny that after the war, everyone wanted to have ridden with Forrest. At the time, a lot of folks didn't want to ride with Forrest. It meant hard fighting, hard riding, hard living. It was dangerous. Forrest wasn't the kind to avoid conflict. He liked wading into it. War means fighting, he said, and fighting means killing. But he never saw a problem with any parts of the equation. War means fighting, and fighting means killing. Forrest learned on the job, but he still did some awful foolish things. As late as the Hood campaign, he still almost comes to blows with a fellow general, Benjamin Franklin Cheatham, over who's going to cross a river at a crossing first. When one is about to be trampled down upon by the enemy, and one is fighting over who gets across a creek first or a river first, I think one's kind of lost sight of the bigger picture. So there was still a little bit of the old Forrest that emerged. Even after the war, there was still a little bit of the old Forrest that would emerge, even from the man who learned to be a better commander, to be more disciplined in his behavior. He still was the kind of man who could let his temper get the better of him. And I think that was a lot of it. His exuberance in war came from the emotion he gave to war. When, after the war, he came to a Memphis tailor shop, and he went up to a tailor who was bringing a suit of clothes for him that had been left for a length of time. He saw that there were moth holes in the clothes. Forrest was enraged by this and pulled out a gun. The tailor said, "You wouldn't shoot me over a trifle like this, would you, General?" He said, seriously as he always did, "I would shoot you like a rat." I think the tailor probably, after he got his composure, one has to wonder what that meant. But when he got his composure, understood that Forrest was deadly serious. Forrest wasn't actually going to kill him, but he didn't know that. Andrew Wells Gould died at the hands of Forrest. Andrew Wells Gould was not a Federal. He was a fellow Confederate. And in fact, Forrest's final sort of statement on him was that if he had been as brave a man on the battlefield as he was in this and the confrontation he had with him, then the confrontation would never have happened. Forrest, I think, is wonderfully human. He's also got a lot of the negatives that come from a human being with all of the faults and all of the problems. He was definitely a product of his time. And I ask, as I always do, whatever group, that you remember to judge him by his time. Good, bad, or indifferent, he was a product of the time he grew up in, not of what we wished he might have been. But one thing I think anyone would say about him, whether they criticize him, I have had people who said essentially this was a moral equivalent of a Nazi, doesn't deserve to be studied. That's okay, I don't have a problem if that's what they think. They're entitled to their opinion. I don't agree with them, which is why I study him. But, this is a moral equivalent of a Nazi. Doesn't deserve to be studied. And I've had others who just simply didn't want to admit that this was a human being with fallibilities, with mistakes, with screw-ups, and with attitudes that shouldn't have been the attitudes he had. He was, in many respects, as I said, a product of his time. After the war, he'd get involved in the Klan. Of course, a lot of people ask about that. He didn't get involved in the Klan, I think, because it was another way to wage war now that the war was over. I think he got involved in the Klan because he felt that going back home wasn't good enough for the authorities of Tennessee, and that Southerners, ex-Confederates, weren't safe in the conditions that had arisen in the post-war. So he saw the Klan and organizations like it as another defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms triggered a lot of his emotions. He was prepared to fight to the death to defend those he loved and his section. Ultimately, he has a lot of ironic views. One reporter asked him after the war, "Who do you see living in this South now that the war's over?" He said, "Africans." Why Africans? This reveals two things. That doesn't suggest to me how broad-minded he is. Wait till you hear the second part. Because they're the best laboring class we have. He saw the South still in need of a laboring class, and he wasn't going to be it. And neither were other white conservative Southern Democrats. So he's a product of his time, good, bad, or indifferent. But he certainly was, I think, however you look at him, one hell of a fighter. He certainly was one of the best, if not the best, cavalry officers ever produced in the Civil War. I don't know that I can speak for all my fellow historians. Maybe you can get Ed to tell you tomorrow comparisons between those who love Jeb Stuart and those who love Bedford Forrest. But to me, I'll take the Forrest any day and leave Stuart back at the cotillion with the ladies. Thank you a whole lot.
Physically, how big was he?
Well, he was over 6 feet, and supposedly the story goes that when he got into battle, he did two things. One, he turned beet red. He turned red as an Indian, is the way they would describe it. And two, he'd almost inflate, almost lift himself up in stature and figure so that he made himself even taller, even fiercer, even stronger looking. He was an intimidating physical individual.
Glad to meet you.
Thank you. Any other questions? No other questions about Forrest? Well, I'll tell you one thing real quick. I know that Ed wore you down, and I was going to joke and say that Lynn had picked me for two reasons. One, he knew I would probably keep it pretty short. And two, he wanted to make a transition between the good disciplined people that were today that had great presentations and the great scholars that come tomorrow. I think you'll thoroughly enjoy all the papers you'll hear tomorrow. These are good folk, and I hope that if you get a choice to choose between shooting the deer and coming to here, you will come to here and get the deer later. I know Bambi will thank you for it.
Oh, in your in your book, there were instances that after a battle, after the secession and close and the close of the day, the darkness, that Forrest would, under flag of truce, go have dinner with his opposition commander.
Well, he was not above visiting with Federals.
I mean, during the war, during the battle, is this?
During the battle, he wouldn't have gone, but if it was over, see, I think what you're thinking about is Wilson. Particularly, he had a conference of sorts with Wilson, James Harrison Wilson, who was the commander that captured Selma and dispersed Forrest's force. As Forrest himself put it, you were the only commander that I have met first and last who beat me. That's not strictly true, by the way, which is typical of Forrest. Forrest had a tendency sometimes to sort of play down certain things. For instance, in the Battle of Dover, where they were going to assault not Fort Donelson, but the nearby fortifications around Dover, Forrest was engaged, but again, sort of impetuously in charging when he really shouldn't have been charging. And what happened was his men got blown away. I mean, he suffered horrendous casualties. And in the aftermath of that battle, he was in a horrible, horrible mood, laying there warming his feet by the fire. And there was another soldier in a bed. He dumped him out so that his aide could go in that bed and take that bed. He was just in a fierce mood, waiting for something to set him off. And Forrest seems to have often been like that, waiting for something to set him off. And in this case, he thought he was hearing something about his men that he didn't appreciate, and he jumped up and basically told Wheeler in a fairly long spiel that he would be in his coffin before he served under his command again for what he was writing about it. So this was the kind of guy who was almost like a powder keg. Well, with Wilson, I think Wilson actually, when he met with him, had the best insight into his character of anybody that I've ever heard. What Wilson said was that here's a man who seems to have involved himself in a number of excesses and yet always had a plausible explanation for it. Forrest, after the Klan is disbanded, has to go before Congress, and I mean, after he personally is through with the Klan for any intents and purpose, has to go before Congress. He spends an awful lot of his time in Congress doing the best job of dodging and weaving anyone could ever imagine. I mean, when he wants to play dumb Southerner, he plays dumb Southerner. He says to a congressman, when a congressman asks him something he doesn't want to answer, he says, well, I reckon, I don't know. And he just plays stupid. When he wants to talk, he rattles on for days. He goes on with numbers and information, all kinds of stuff, but when they're about to catch him in something, he clams up and acts stupid. He acts Southern. Which kind of shows that the man had a lot on the ball. He was able to use what they saw as a weakness to his advantage, which of course is typical on the battlefield. If he could sniff out a weakness, you were in trouble, because he pressed that weakness to the end. So he did meet with commanders, and Wilson was one example of it, and but I don't recall anything during a battle. The only other time I can recall two other instances that he ran up against Federals, and neither time did he really intend to. One was a flag of truce situation, and he thought it was a flag of truce. It was a signal flag. And when he rode up, the Federals stood on and said, General Forrest, this is not a truce flag, a truce. Ride off, leave, go. And he raised his hat and saluted and took off. The second time was at Parker's Crossroads, where he rode up. Some Federals ordered him to stop and surrender. And Forrest said, wait a minute, I'll go back and get my men and surrender them too. And they said, okay. And he never came back. I think they thought that, boy, they had big eyes.
Having lived by the sword, did he die by the sword?
He died as quietly as one can die in one's own bed. Unfortunately, his health had totally deteriorated by the time he died. He died in 1877, and he had something akin to chronic diarrhea. It's really debatable exactly what he had. I've talked to some scientist friends of mine who said that he had, what they think he had was a condition where the intestines are not absorbing the way they're supposed to, and everything just literally sort of passes straight through. So he was eating but he was not retaining any nourishment, so he was literally starving himself to death even when he was eating. So it was kind of, so they said he was almost like a skeleton.
Did he spend his health during the war?
Oh, I think he spent a good deal of it during the war. I think the man lived and fought as hard as he knew how to live and fight, and the war, I think, took a toll on him. But he came back after the war, and he was pretty robust. And there's one of the things, if you ever go to Fort Pillow, and you know, Ed does a tour, probably several tours where you can go to Fort Pillow. You ought to go once at least. On the wall at Fort Pillow is a facsimile copy of his life insurance application. He lied on that too. He lied on that too. He said he wasn't wounded as often as he'd been wounded.
Who owns this place in Oklahoma County now?
That's a good question. I don't know. I've been out there. The only thing left is a cistern. That's the only thing that's there. There's nothing else that I've seen. And I don't know who owns it. There is a cabin that has recently kind of come to my attention in the last couple of years in Middle Tennessee that's still standing. That's supposed to have been one of his early boyhood cabins. I don't know who owns that either.
Along the lines of his death, what is the story and the status of his burial underneath the statue in Memphis, and what's the current political tone of that?
Well, the current political tone is not what it used to be, which is always the case, but Forrest, of course, died and was buried in the Elmwood Cemetery and was reinterred at the base of the statue, the equestrian statue in Forest Park. So was his wife. And if you go today, at the base of the statue, you can see the name inscriptions where they're buried. That statue has brought, through time, has gone from one of the most revered, and when it was first put up, you know, in the newspapers, big ceremonies, people loved and worshipped it, and I'm sure it's pretty much felt the same way that is Anglo-American people, until the Civil Rights Movement, when it took some fire, and of course in the post-Civil Rights Movement took some fire. And the various groups and types have asked for it to be removed. It's in a predominantly black neighborhood, so it is a rather ironic location.
Who actually owns the land? Was that land that Forrest at one time owned, or?
Well, as far as I know, the city or the state, I'm not sure which, but it is a protected. Yeah, it's a protected environment. It's not private. It's not in private hands.
Well, why the movement of his body there?
Oh, just to honor him.
So the city did it?
It was done as sort of a big ceremony. I mean, really just a lavish, you know, parade, speeches, wreath layings, the works. I mean, it was one of those lost cause celebrations.
When was that?
I want to say 1902, or somewhere in that neighborhood, somewhere in the early 1900s.
Is there any emotion about that now? Excuse me, I'm sorry. I mean, what is the emotion about that at the present time?
I think basically indifference by most folk, by some folk reverence, by other folk indifference. I mean, I think it's gone through its phase of someone attempting to try to get it removed to being something someone doesn't even think about. If they're inclined to be anti-Forrest, they just don't. They're not into that like that.
Was his favorite horse named King Ferdinand?
No, his favorite horse was named Broderick. Broderick was killed during the war, and the horse that he's most associated with after the war was King Philip. King Philip was so devoted to him at one point that supposedly it would nip at the blue-coated policemen in the streets of Memphis, even one time racing down, chasing a group of them with an elderly lady in the carriage screaming. And one comment was made at some point, your slaves fight for you and your horses fight for you. I see why you were so successful.
In Fort Pillow, in your book, you mentioned that his greatest indictment was losing control of his troops, and it was that he ordered a massacre. Can you address that Fort Pillow incident?
Sure. The Fort Pillow incident, of course, April 1864, had to do with the capture of an isolated garrison made up of two people that Forrest and his men would have had nothing but utter disdain for. African-American troops and Tennessee Unionists. The indictment after the war is that this, or not after the war, but after the incident during the war, as part of the wartime propaganda machine by the North, was that Forrest had had a deliberate massacre that he had planned and attempted to carry out. Forrest was the kind of person at Murfreesboro, and I've already mentioned Murfreesboro, so I'll make a connection to that, had made a comment which I think is also very true of him. His comment was, I didn't mean to make half a job, to come here to make half a job of it, I mean to have them all. I didn't come here to do half a job, I meant to have them all. If he had meant to massacre the garrison, he wouldn't have batted an eyebrow about it. The fact that he didn't mean that he cared one whit about the people in the fort. In fact, I would say, if you want to know how I think he felt about them, he had utter contempt for them. He didn't think that blacks should be soldiers. He didn't think Tennessee Unionists were, decent, ordinary folk who should be given any mercy. But he didn't see any reason to wipe them all out either. Of course, in his dispatch that is in the official records prior to capturing Fort Pillow, says they have weapons and supplies and horses we need. That's what his focus was on, their military value. I think he felt like the fort was an easy mark because it was defended by contemptible people who weren't men enough, soldier enough, equal to the soldiers he led enough to even defend the fort. I think he was very mad that they attempted to defend the fort, but I don't think he used that anger toward them to try to wipe them out, or he would have. He turns over prisoners, including black prisoners. During the battle, I think one of the best things to me is the statement of a doctor from Iowa who is, has no agenda, would have no... McPherson uses the same argument, by the way, about a Southern soldier who says Forrest ordered us to blow the brains out of the soldiers in the fort. Well, Forrest, there is no order, there is no such order. If it was given, it was never recorded as an order. It does not mean that it wasn't the understanding the men had. I think the men in his command had their own personal agendas, and people were killed that should not have been killed. I don't think there's any doubt about that. That's war. People die who shouldn't be killed in wars all the time. In this case, some of it was cold-blooded murder. It was not a policy that way. In fact, Forrest, again, just to tie back to his past, had made his money as a slave trader. To him, the proper thing to be done with the African Americans in the fort was to return them to their proper owners. I mean, that's not a commendable thing, but that's, again, he's a product of his time.
What was the casualties depicted in the so-called massacre? How many men were there? How many people were killed? How many people were slaughtered or murdered?
Yeah, that's actually, of course, we know how many men supposedly died. There are actually about 5 sets of figures, depending on which one you take. And I don't know them all off the top of my head. I'd have to look. But we know that there are several different ways that people calculated. I don't guess we'll ever know how many of them died legitimately, quote unquote, in attempting to defend the fort and attempting to defend themselves, firing back. They were combat casualties. And how many of them were someone who tried to surrender and the guy said, I'm not letting you surrender, boom. And we know that that kind of thing happened.
But it was a long way from all.
It was a long way from all. That's true.
It was a long way from what?
All of the people. They turned over, I think, about 70 to 90, and that was turned over, not the ones who managed to escape. That was the ones they had in their possession that they could have.
So you think most of this...
But why would Forrest have left witnesses if his intent had been to kill these folks? Why not kill them all?
So you think that these soldiers were acting on their own volition rather than anything direct or implied from Forrest?
Well, now, those are two different thoughts. Direct, I don't think. Implied is possible. Certainly the men couldn't have thought that Forrest would have minded what they were doing, or they wouldn't have done it. So I think they felt very likely that Forrest either would agree with them or certainly wouldn't care. And again, I think his statement about official policy was that he wanted to return them to their rightful owners. That's what he thought the proper policy to do. would be. And I mean, I'm not going to gloss this over. Forrest was a hard-nosed, crude man, racist to the bone. He had his idea about who was on top, who was on the bottom, and why they were there. I mean, that's straight to the bone. But Forrest was a product of his time. Abraham Lincoln was a racist too. You look at the Emancipation Proclamation and what it actually says. I mean, you can and look at what he did in the process of arriving at that point and why he did it. The people of that time period had different racial attitudes than we do. It just makes them different.
What about Forrest's family? Did he have children?
Yes, he had 2 children, and one died fairly early. A boy and a girl. One died fairly early. The boy will follow him into war and will pretty much stay with him. In fact, one of the things I also found really moving to me about Forrest was a letter that I don't think he personally wrote because he couldn't write very well. Another sort of statement, I'll just make this real quick because it kind of fits the theme. One of my favorite lines he said was in talking about chasing the Yankees, he said they run like sons of bitches. He enjoyed that. He enjoyed running them. And he spelled sons S-U-N-S. I mean, he was a straightforward killed, K-I-L-D. I mean, that's the way he was, which is why he probably didn't say Firstus. It had too many letters. But in a letter that supposedly he wrote to his son, which probably someone wrote for him, he expressed essentially the feeling that he didn't think he would survive the war, and if he did, he wouldn't survive it at home. He would be in exile and be somewhere else, and that he wanted his son to do what he had done, take over the family, see that things were done, and to be more like your mother, which was his overall message. He saw in his wife, Mary Ann, everything he was not and should be or wanted to be. One of the classic lines with his wife was when he went to her guardian and he said, I want to marry Mary Ann. And the man said, well, Bedford, you can't marry her. You cuss and gamble, and Mary Ann's a Christian girl. And he said, I know, that's why I want her. But he knew what she was, and that's what he wanted. And for his son, for him to say, be careful of, great advice. Be careful of who you're with. You're known by the company you keep. He didn't put it exactly that way, but that's essentially, he said, shun bad company or something, is the way he put it. Well, he wouldn't have known what shun was if somebody had come up and showed it to him in a dictionary. He didn't know the fancy words, but he knew, stay away from those folk. And somebody else wrote it down in a nice way. His youngest brother, Jeffrey, was like a son to him. And Forrest is utterly devastated when his youngest brother was killed at the Battle of Oklahoma. And yet how does he express his grief? Goes out and tries to kill some more Yankees. And that's just the way it was.
Have you met any descendants of Forrest in your research?
Yeah. I've met a number of them. I have not met one family, which is sort of unfortunate because it's a family I'd like to have met, a family in Atlanta that had a lot of papers from the Reconstruction era that Forrest had wrote that they didn't want anybody to see. And I'd love to have told them that they needed to get over that because their concern was that in the letters Forrest was asking for help and sounded, as they put it, pathetic. What he was doing was he was in terrible financial straits. His life was crumbling around him from all intents and purposes. And the man, instead of quitting or putting a gun to his head, was asking his friends to help. What a terrible indictment that you would hope that your friends would step up to help you in a time of crisis and need. I think it speaks volumes for the man and greatly for him. He thought he had friends in this world. What a thing to think.
Does he still have direct descendants living?
No, direct descendants, as far as I know, were gone.
Nathan Bedford Forrest III
He was shot down over Germany, right.
Oh.
And that sort of fits the Forrest mentality, too. Supposedly, someone who's in the squadron with him told me this story, and I don't know how true or not true it is, but I'll tell it to you, that he had an idea for a new bomber formation and was going to go over to Germany with it, and the higher-ups told him he couldn't do it, so in true Forrest fashion, he took off, got in the formation he was supposed to be in. When he got close to Germany, he got into this formation, which was a diamond formation, which he was the lead plane, and he was shot down. So they
I take care of a man that was in that squadron.
Really?
He was shot down.
It's a deep penetration, it's over heel.
That's right.
Over heel in 43.
That's right. His body supposedly washed up off of
Off the where?
Kiel,
He's
Germany.
right on Kiel.
Northern Germany.
Did they recover his body and bury it properly?
They recovered it and buried it. I think he's buried in Europe. No, he may have been brought to Arlington. I can't remember.
They have a memorial stone at
It seemed to me there's a stone in Europe.
yeah, there's a memorial stone in,
Memphis.
but that is the real stone.
How broad is, your search obviously is very broad, and you didn't isolate on any particular archives or?
No, you couldn't really with Forrest. The bad thing was there was only about 8 or 10 original letters, and they're almost indecipherable. It's almost impossible to read them. You have to keep working at it to just try to figure out what he's saying, and your spelling goes down as you do it. I mean, you start, let's see, did he say Holt, H-O-L-T? You know, I mean, I think that's what it is.
Did he really say, if somebody asked him after the war, you mentioned that he had 29 horses shot out in London, and he had killed 30, had 29 horses, and when they asked him about that, he said, well, I was a horse ahead in the end.
Supposedly he thought he was one up. One way or another, he said he thought he was one up.
But he
A horse ahead is how I've heard it too.
Last question.
Can I ask Ed one question? I'm trying to ask Ed one question.
No, go ahead.
Where did they bury the people that were killed in Champion Hill?
In theory, they both dead were buried on the battlefield originally. The Union dead, and I'm not going to say all the Union dead, but most of them that they know where they were are disinterred in 1866 and 67 and buried in the Vicksburg National Cemetery. The Confederate dead, reputedly, again going by word of mouth, in the Champion family tradition, the tradition is that they're buried on burial pits and it would be in the area probably where the logging took place, because I went out with Sid 3 in 56, and the tradition then that they were on the Confederate burial pits. And I was going to say all of them were on the north or on the south of the area where the gravel pit is. But that is simply oral history. There is no record of them being disinterred. There is a record of the Union dead being disinterred.
So their graves been disturbed?
Well, it depends how much destruction they did when they did the timbering over there. But it was on the section where the Champion family tradition took place. And I don't know if Sid Forrest was ever out with his father out there. It was on the south side of the slope beyond the gravel pits.
Brian, thank you very much.